So I'm not gonna lie, I'm just kind of annoyed by all of the misinformation about the labor market out there right now because at the end of the day, especially when you're kind of late cycle, as we are, at least what I would consider to be now, um, there's a lot of narrative spin misinformation out there. And so maybe after this video, people can start to at least consider that all the signs were probably there from the get go. I'm not saying by any means that those signs were flashing imminent recession this entire time, but they were there. Uh, and so I just figured I would go through a couple of different cuts of the two surveys that measure employment at a national level and just see what we can learn from that. And maybe if we just cut it a certain way, maybe visualize it a certain way, then that can sort of add some context. And so, just quickly, I'll sort of summarize the differences between the two surveys. What we're looking at here is the establishment survey, and the other one is called the household survey. And really, the main differences are so the household survey counts multiple job holders once, so one person, one job. Whereas this survey, the establishment survey, does not make this distinction. So you could theoretically have one person on two separate payrolls, and they would both get counted. The household survey also has varying degrees of coverage in terms of who it picks up. And so uh, the household survey captures people who are like unincorporated and self employed, whereas this one does not. And there are some other differences in terms of coverage, but I'll just kind of leave it there. The other important point I would make too is just the actual direction of the survey matters too. So the establishment survey, as the name sort of suggests, is employer facing, and so they're surveying employers to get this information, whereas the household survey is more like obviously household or consumer facing. So um, those are the main differences between the two. The information in terms of the granularity and the iterations also differs between the two. The establishment survey gets, and both of them do. I mean, they get, you can break down these industries very granularly. Uh, I would say, generally speaking, the household survey has more of a demographic flavor to it. Uh, and surprisingly or not, it's for whatever reason, it's going to be a lot harder for the average Joe to look at these iterations because it requires somebody being able to map this information using some sort of database software, which is what you're looking at here. And so the reason I like to look at it this way is because it allows me to sort of process it more efficiently rather than clicking through Fred. And you can see, generally speaking, how it all sort of works together, especially if you visualize it several different ways, which I'm showing here. And so, um, yeah, I mean, we'll just kind of get into the establishment survey right off the bat. Uh, what I'm showing here is it's the same information, just presented three separate ways. The top left is the stock of jobs cut by industry. Below that is the share of jobs by industry, and just, of course, how that's changed over time. And then the year over year look at that same data. And so we're just trying to identify some patterns here. And right away, what jumps out at me is you, you tend to see government jobs as a share of all jobs sort of pick up the slack in a softening labor market. And so and I would also say healthcare too is pretty representative of that as well, especially current day. Um, and so what that is really doing is masking weakness in the market. And you might ask yourself, okay, well, the unemployment rate is low right now, but quite frankly, like I genuinely wonder how many people even understand how that's calculated. And I've made this point before. I mean, if somebody told you what the unemployment rate was and you knew nothing about jobs, labor, whatever, and they just gave you one data point and they said, it's this. And maybe they had a smile on their face. Maybe it's, hey, the unemployment rate is 4.1%. Oh, well, that sounds great. I guess I'm enlightened now. No, it doesn't mean anything. Okay. So this is a much better way of looking at it. Of course, it's one way of looking at it. This is a real long term trend. So you have proper context. Again, that's a big thing. Always with the context. And so, again, only one way of presenting it. So let's just show it a different way. So same setup, this time just total private and government, which combined account for the entire stock of jobs. But this just sort of illustrates the point about government jobs sort of taking over and masking that weakness. All right. But we're just looking at jobs. We can look at something like average weekly earnings, just in terms of the dollar figure, and just even year over year by industry. And I know this is a little noisy. It's not seasonally adjusted, but what you tend to notice, especially if you look like through a proper cycle like GFC or something like that, you know, earnings, average weekly earnings typically flatline, or growth in earnings slows considerably, or just outright deflates. And I could click through this and show folks, but I mean, the trend is pretty much consistent, varying rates of change, but across a lot of these industries. And so that's really just kind of the point I'm trying to make there. There's all of these signs that indicate that there's weakness in the labor market. Um, okay, so now I just want to make a point about, okay, financial activities. Let's just look at one industry, the industry in pink here. And so I know, because there's a in each of these industries, like there's subcategories, and then there may be even a cut deeper than that, and that's when you get into like 4 or 5 digit NAICS codes, which you don't have to understand. It's just a sub category. So like all these things like roll up into one category, then that rolls up into another, and so on and so forth. So back to financial activities. The two buckets there are finance and insurance, and real estate, rental, and leasing. Okay, those are the two categories in financial activities. Let's just focus on finance and insurance to prove a point. And I'm just showing it year over year too. Okay, so to me, that is a recessionary trend. Okay, you see how it's rolling over as of late. All right, so let's look specifically at just activities related to credit intermediation and see, and then that's, of course, this area, and see if that gives us any more insight into what is actually happening. Okay. So this indicates to me quite clearly that that's a recessionary trend. And you might say, hey, well, it's recovering. Well, rates are still high. They haven't cut rates meaningfully. We haven't really returned to any sort of affordability, especially in the housing market. That's why I'm focused on finance and insurance, because this captures mortgage and non-mortgage loan brokers. You see that sort of light blue color? I mean, that's there for a purpose. Okay, so just trying to flesh out. There are so many details under the surface. If you're just paying attention, they're all there, and they're all sort of pointing in the same direction. So now, I mean, what about government? What's going on in that government bucket? So let's just kind of look at that and see what's going on. And as you can see, government isn't just government. I mean, you have local, state, and federal government. So we really do need to make the distinction. And here you can quite clearly see that local government is really the ad, okay? I mean, it should be pretty clear. And in fact, I can take it even further than that. I can cut this even more, right? And so there it is, cut even in more depth. So really, you're seeing a decent amount of what I mean, we'll call it a few months ago, in the past year or so, it was really education, local education, that was contributing to a lot of ad in government, and now you're really seeing it on the administrative side, right? I mean, can you kind of see that uh, pickup? So just want to be clear on that. And look, you can cut every industry like this, and you're going to just get more insight. But now let's go and just look at the other one quickly. And I'm not going to go through literally every single cut of this information. I'm just showing it to prove a point, and that is there's a lot under the surface. I don't know why people don't show this. Probably because there's a lot of value in this. At least I think so. Somebody might disagree with me, but that's fine. So let's look at the same thing. Let's look at the stock of jobs like we did from the get go for the establishment survey, this time for the household survey, or otherwise known as the current population survey, CPS. What I am noticing is, oh, well, it is actually available by industry. So what if I even compared by industry the change in, whatever it may be, leisure and hospitality or construction, CPS versus CES, and see what that yields. And look, there's a lot of information there. I'm not showing it. I've done that analysis. And here's what I would say. I mean, something like construction and leisure hospitality are showing further weakness than what you're seeing in the establishment survey, and that could be capturing a lot of people with second jobs over in the establishment survey in those industries. And so there's all of these factors that need to be considered. There is clear weakness when I look at all of the iterations in the household survey, but I just wanted people to be aware that it gets cut like this, even though you don't really see it presented like ever. At least I don't. So now, again, I referenced that there is sort of a demographic flavor to all of this data, and it really adds a lot of color in terms of what's actually happening from an employment standpoint. And when I look at this, I just automatically think, oh, well, no wonder we're an older country. 55 plus is now roughly 30% of our population. 25, 30 years ago, it was closer to 20%. And so that only makes sense to me, right? But we're just looking at employment. I mean, you could cut this by age and sex and look at like the labor force this way, and you would get even more insight. I'm not showing it, but I'm just saying what's available. Now we could look at the labor force participation rate by age and sex groups. These are 10-year buckets. It's the prime working age plus an additional group, 55 to 64-year-olds. And the reason I like to show this chart is it's so, in my opinion, important to debunking this idea that you're going to suddenly have all these dual income households that are going to be able to afford things like housing costs. And let's just debunk that right away. Okay, can we just put that to bed in the fact that have already seen women come into the workforce in huge numbers? You can actually observe at a very granular level employment by sex, like down, if you wanted to look at it at the county. Now it may only be available uh, but with annual figures, but you can still see that. And so this idea of dual income households really driving home prices higher and this and that is just a bunch of BS. Okay, yes, there are going to be certain really micro segments of any market where that may be true, but in the aggregate, that is BS. Okay, this chart tells that story. And if you're uh, unfamiliar with how this is calculated, go look it up. It will add a lot of color to even just understanding something like the unemployment rate. So now, but understand, we're looking at the participation rate here. What if you could look at like labor force flows by sex? And the reason I like to show this is because it sort of gets back to the idea of like, what is something like the labor force? What is the unemployment rate? And how do they keep tabs on it? And so what this is showing is labor force flow, specifically uh, men employed to unemployed, men and women, both employed to unemployed. You could also cut this by, as you can see below in the in one of the filters, the one on the right, you could also show this as not in the labor force to unemployed. So just mechanically think about what that does to something like the unemployment rate. There's all of these things that go in to sort of influencing why kind of the unemployment rates can become so volatile, especially like when you get late into a rate hiking cycle. And I just want to add one more thing too. You do not need to see claims spike materially for the unemployment rate to go up meaningfully. Okay. I just want to make that clear because you do not have to claim benefits when you qualify for them, aka when you're unemployed. You do not have to do that. Okay, so all of these things get measured. It's not something that people look into all the time because it's like too in the weeds, I guess, or whatever. It's above people. Probably because it's not in Fred, but whatever. I can't do anything about that. Go over to the Department of Labor, look up things like replacement rates, recipiency rates, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. Now, what if we could sort of cut the unemployment level or even the unemployment rate by reasons for unemployment? And so that's what this is doing right now. What I notice when I look at this is a pretty cookie cutter textbook recessionary trend. I mean, you're having permanent job losers and reentrance to the labor force sort of, they're contributing to the unemployment rate moving higher. Like if you look at something like the permanent job losers as a percentage of the labor force, if you see that thing historically get above like 1%, you are basically at the doorstep of a recession. I don't care what anybody says. I'm just looking at the numbers. Okay. So just want to make that point. But look, I mean, right now, I mean, we've cut it a bunch of different ways. But what if we were to even just look at something like construction, like the industry, but what it looks like in terms of the occupation level, in terms of jobs in the construction industry? So think of it this way: this would be like a company that is in construction. That's all they do. And so rather than like, you know, talking about leisure and hospitality jobs and things like that, these are just sort of main buckets of employment for, say, a construction company. And so when I look at this, I've looked at it just in terms of the stock of jobs by occupation. It should be kind of obvious, but like construction and extraction, sort of your laborers are going to be, your biggest employment bucket here. That is slowing considerably. And you're also seeing just overall weakness across pretty much every single occupation in the construction industry. I mean, look at management, business, and financial operations. Why would that be happening? So, look, we'll end it here, but I just wanted to make a point. These are not things that people commonly show. So it really should make people step back and really like question this narrative out there. Is like, are you really confident that you can say, well, I'm not sure if there is weakness in the labor market? Well, there's a lot more data points out there than you probably realize. And so that's really the point I wanted to make. Go look at both of these in detail. you'll see what I'm talking about. So, all right, guys, that's all I got.